Welcome to the Same Day Podcast, where we discuss driving incremental business growth and other topics related to real estate, property management, and entrepreneurship. Now to the show at hand.
Matt Zolk here. I'm the host of the Same Day Podcast, where I connect with top business experts and real estate leaders. We've had tons of past guests on. We've had Devin Hallen talking about economic development in Fayetteville. Yoni Schmidt of the Keyrenter team, who also hosts this show, has talked to plenty of property owners and answers some of their frequently asked questions. And we've also had folks on from different HVAC companies talking about the systems that they install and repair and how they work and why they're so expensive, which is a serious concern these days. Today's episode is brought to you by Chris Lyle State Farm. Chris Lyle State Farm helps you protect your most precious assets and investments, whether it's your home and auto, investment rental properties, or other valuables. Call Chris Lyle State Farm for a quick and painless phone call to potentially save you double digits on all of your insurance needs. Visit diallyle.com, diallile.com, or call his office at 918-878-7771. Today's episode is also brought to you by Keyrenter Property Management. At Keyrenter Property Management, we are a full-service property management company helping our clients buy, renovate, and operate real estate assets. We help our clients build wealth while taking the headache out of property management. And that's why no matter what rental you have, a single-family home, a condo, a townhome, apartment, we have the management solutions that you need. Go to KeyrenterPMC.com. Today's guest is Keili McEwen, and she serves as Vice President of Governmental Affairs at Tinker Federal Credit Union, Oklahoma's largest credit union. In this role, she leads all state and federal advocacy, legislative strategy, and political engagement on behalf of the $6 billion financial institution. With more than 2 decades of experience in public policy, political strategy, and coalition building, Keili brings a forward-thinking approach to influence rooted in principle and purpose. A trailblazer in credit union advocacy, she was the first in-house lobbyist for a not-for-profit financial institution in Oklahoma. Her leadership has helped shape the future of credit union policy while ensuring the voices of members and mission-driven institutions are effectively represented in government. Keili McEwen, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. How are you today, Matt?
I'm good, but I am a little bit jealous of your pod. I'll be honest.
Yeah.
I'm in a shared office, and it can be problematic. I would like to get some of those pods. They're surprisingly expensive, I should say. They're like, some of them are like $7 or $8,000. So I've been reluctant to add pods in my office, but eventually we're going to move to a different space. But I should just start out transparently. I'm jealous.
Well, the pod is cool. It's soundproof and very private, despite the fact that I am also in a shared space right now.
So Tinker Federal Credit Union. A lot of our listeners probably don't understand, and I would count myself among those people that don't understand the difference between a credit union, or what's unique about a credit union versus a traditional commercial bank. Can you help us understand?
Yeah, absolutely. So credit unions are financial institutions, just like any bank in your community. A credit union can open accounts. We have lending products. If you need a car loan, we can certainly help you with that, or a mortgage. But what makes a credit union maybe a little bit different than the banks in your community is that we are a member-owned financial institution. And so in order to do business with a credit union, you have to qualify for our field of membership. So in Tinker's case, it's sort of in our name, but lots of credit unions, it's not as obvious. But our original field of membership, for which we were created in 1946, was to serve employees at Tinker Air Force Base, both civilian and military employees there on base. Over the years, credit union field of memberships have changed significantly. And so, we now have additional fields of membership throughout the state of Oklahoma, doing business with what are called select employee groups. And so, and that's a model or a multiple common bond credit union. So many credit unions that are federal in nature, meaning we're federally regulated, have field of membership that is expanded beyond their original field of membership. But you do still have to qualify for membership in order to bank with us, to access our products and loans. And then we are governed by our members. And so every member at TFCU, which there are about 475-ish thousand members,
Wow.
across Oklahoma, across the US, and even the globe, as you can imagine, with military in our
Sure.
membership, have a vote in our operations. And so every year at our annual meeting, our membership, the entire 470,000 folks who do business with us have a vote in the way that our credit union is run and governed. Now, they don't all show up to that
Sure.
meeting. Thankfully, we wouldn't have the space for them. But they certainly do have the right to vote in terms of our membership and governance structures. And so we are also governed by our members. And so we have a board of directors, much like a nonprofit has a board of directors. They're volunteers that come from our field of membership and serve in a volunteer capacity rather than having shareholders. Those are the high level differences between sort of banks and credit unions. It's really membership, ownership, and governance.
And does governance stretch or extend to the point where they'd say like they want to dictate or help guide the spread between the cost of deposits and the price of a loan? Or not that far, not like intricate details of operations?
Yeah, it sort of depends on the credit union and how how they engage their board of directors. Certainly, in our case, yeah, the answer to that question is yes. But every credit union is a little bit different. It's governed a little bit differently because the board comes from the membership.
Yeah.
That looks a little bit different everywhere you go, depending on the size of the credit union, what the asset size is. We're a larger credit union, and so we have a pretty involved board in terms of governance. Some credit unions don't, but and honestly, the asset size isn't actually really what dictates that. It's more leadership and institutional knowledge and how long leaders have been in their roles. And so, and honestly, just the bylaws of each organization. Yeah. So
how does the $6 billion of assets at TFCU stack up against other banks and credit unions? I should say nationally rather than globally.
Nationally, but yeah. Yeah, I mean, we are one of the larger financial institutions in Oklahoma where we're based. Nationally, in terms of credit unions, we are a top 50 credit union nationally. So there are, credit unions that are very small that are serving, just a singular community, or even could be serving just a singular select employee group or community organization. You'll see credit unions sometimes that are serving maybe just a congregation at a church or a local business, whereas some credit unions are much larger. And of course, they go all the way up to Navy Federal Credit Union, which is the largest in the country, and is serving millions of members across military installations and even across the globe. Navy has a significant presence on some bases, in the UK and Germany, across Europe and other places. So, but we are one of the larger in the country. There are about 4,600 credit unions in the US.
Would you, in terms of comparison with a commercial bank, would you expect that rates for your assets, a client's liability, a loan, that they would be similar to commercial rates at other places? Is it competitive?
Yeah, I would say we're certainly competitive. One of the benefits of a credit union is that because we are member owned, we return our revenue back to our membership. And so, that is the charge of a credit union. And so we often do that by offering competitive rates on loan products. And that sort of varies because it depends on what product you're specifically talking about. Sure. I would say our rates are very competitive in terms of the Oklahoma environment. And we offer dividends back to our members as well. And so in terms of having a product that is attractive to the consumer, it's often a lower rate or a higher dividend on a deposit product. And so, credit unions are known for being consumer financial institutions. We lean toward more we lean more toward consumer banking
Sure.
than commercial banking. And that doesn't mean we don't do commercial banking. We certainly do. We do business lending here at TFCU, but most of our products are consumer facing, and you'll find that's the case across credit unions.
Yeah. Interesting. So if somebody did, and then this is not really the subject of our conversation, we're going to delve into governmental affairs and your role as a VP of governmental affairs, but I do want to make sure that people can reach out to TFCU, Tinker Federal Credit Union, if they want to become a member. Where would they find out more information on the membership criteria? What fields, I can't remember what you called it, fields of interest, fields of
membership. Yeah.
Fields of membership that would where they would qualify or not qualify to be members of the bank.
Yeah, absolutely. So tinkerfcu.org is our website. I encourage listeners to go check out our website. You can find lots of information, not only about who Tinker Federal Credit Union is, but also where we're located. We have more than 30 branches across the state of Oklahoma, as well as a few in North Texas. And so, one way to learn more about who we are is to visit a branch. We have great branch staff. They would love to visit with folks if they're interested in, getting a loan, opening an account, whatever it may be, whether they want to open a share account or checking account, whatever it may be. And so tinkerfcu.org has all of the great information that listeners might like to check out.
Okay, let's turn to your role as VP of Governmental Affairs. What does that mean? I don't think we've had anybody on in the past that has had a title like that or has worked in that field. So what does that mean? What do you focus your day-to-day on at TFCU doing?
Yeah, so great question. I am focusing most of my time on the regulatory environment for financial institutions. I read not too long ago that there are two industries in the U.S. that are the most regulated, that is banking, financial services, or healthcare. And so we have a robust regulatory environment. And so I spend a lot of my time focused on, we're a federally regulated credit union. And so I spend a lot of my time thinking about and researching and reading and meeting with federal regulators. And trying to forecast what the regulatory environment will look like, 6 months to a year in the future, and sharing that back with the leadership of my credit union, so that we're prepared for regulatory changes that are coming down the pike. I also spend a good amount of time trying to change or amend current regulations that are cumbersome for whatever reason, whether it's to the operations of the credit union, to the membership itself. And so, advocating with the regulators on behalf of the credit union and our members regarding how the regulatory environment is creating challenges or hurdles is a big part of my job. I do the same on the legislative side as well. So I am a registered lobbyist. I work both at the Oklahoma State Capitol and the U.S. Capitol, working with lawmakers to understand or to really educate them on what credit unions are, how we operate, what our operations look like across the state and our branch footprint, and sort of the same thing that I talked about on the regulatory side, forecasting what's coming down the pike. I spent a lot of time, especially this week. Congress has been in recess for the last 5 weeks. They came back yesterday. And so when Congress comes back into session, they release a lot of new bill text. And so I've been reading bills in the last 48 hours. Yeah. Well, I love to read bills. So, somebody's got to do it. Right. Yeah. And so this is, I really actually enjoy reading legislative text, which makes me probably and one of your nerdier guests, but
in the minority, I would say.
Yeah. So I've been reading bill text and trying to, get a sense for where Congress is headed as it relates to appropriations in the financial services space and in the housing space as well. Of course, we do a lot of work with mortgage lending, and
Sure.
and so some key bills have been introduced in the last few days related to housing policy, and so I spend a lot of time doing research and reading And then we formulate a position on legislation and we go to Congress. And I'm actually headed to DC this week to say to members of Congress, hey, Mr. Congressman, this bill is, not ideal for us. We'd like to potentially make some changes or amendments to it, or even, have you vote no on it. Or on the other side of that coin, we love this bill that so and so's introduced. It's really good for business for us, and so we'd love for you to support that.
Would you be speaking to Oklahoma representatives, or would you
Yes,
be speaking to like a broader pool, like other representatives of other states?
So primarily Oklahoma and North Texas members of Congress. So I work with occasionally. That will go a little broader to maybe a committee chair or somebody who has a particular interest in an issue related to credit unions. So I've met with, the Financial Services Committee chair who's from Arkansas, or some folks from Central Texas who introduced some legislation related to veterans lending. And, so it sort of depends on the issue. But by and large, it's the Oklahoma delegation and some folks from North Texas as well.
What's an example of a piece, like a specific piece of legislation? What did it want to do? What was your position? How did your advocacy change the outcome for either credit unions in Oklahoma, across the state, or the members in Oklahoma?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example of a piece of legislation that I'm actively working on right now. Credit unions by statute, by federal statute, we are capped at how much of our total asset mix can be can be lent out through commercial lending. Because we are consumer-facing financial institutions, we have a cap on our commercial lending side, and that's
meaning a member comes in and they say, "I've got all these accounts receivables. I want to borrow money against that to buy a new truck." That'd be a commercial
right.
Loan for a member of the credit union.
Right. So if they are going to use it for commercial purposes,
right?
Yes, and so we can only lend out 12.25% of our total assets on the commercial side. And so, sometimes credit unions get really close to that threshold. And so we look for creative ways to use the legislative process to help us lend more in the commercial space. And so I've been working with a large coalition of credit unions. This is not unique to TFCU, but a large coalition of credit unions who specifically serve members of the military or the defense community to allow any loan that's made to a veteran-owned business to be exempt from the cap. And so in your example, if that gentleman came in and he was looking for a truck, but he had served in, the United States Air Force and he was a veteran, and we made the loan, then that specific loan would be exempt from that 12.25% cap. And so that just gives us a little bit of creative flexibility to continue to serve members who there are lots of veterans in our field of membership because of our relationship with the military.
Sure.
And so we've worked across the country with credit unions that serve on military bases to try to advance that legislation and have some movement on it. And so because I think members of Congress recognize that not only is it important for credit unions to have commercial lending flexibility, but also to serve a key population pocket, and that is veterans who traditionally have a harder time accessing financial services.
And who would be on the other side of you talking to a congressman or woman and saying, "I don't think this should pass. I don't think that this is appropriate for more than 12, what did you say, 12.25 or 12.5% of the of the assets?"
Yeah, it's 12.25%. Now, on that veteran specific issue, there's not a lot of opposition to that specific issue. That's the hurdle with that specific piece of legislation is just getting it through Congress, which is hard to do for any piece of legislation, frankly. But in terms of just the cap itself, commercial bankers would probably be on the other side of that issue.
Do they stand to lose
because,
that business?
right, it's a competitive environment, right? And everyone is competing for deposits and competing in order to make loans. And so, if your business model is different than ours, but you're in the financial institutions space, it would make sense that you would be opposed to us having a higher cap, credit unions having a higher cap,
Right.
or
Right.
any flexibilities as it relates to our cap.
And where do your lobbying efforts stand in the process? I mean, are you actively talking when you go to DC later in the week? Are you actively going to be talking to representatives about that legislation?
I am, yes. So this is a bill we've been working on for a few years.
Wow.
And a lot of it is caught up. Yeah, it takes a long time, unfortunately, to pass legislation, especially when you're talking about federal legislation.
Yeah.
Congress moves slow until they move fast. And so we often work on legislation it's usually a multi-year effort to get a piece of legislation through Congress. It requires a lot of member education. We, for the last few months, have been trying to get co-sponsors on that specific bill. And so, when a bill has a lot of co-sponsors, that gives it more likelihood to get across the finish line.
What kind of strikes me as curious about this whole exercise is that when we hear lobbyists, I think of the movie Thank You for Smoking. You think of Coca-Cola's lobbyists, big pharma lobbyists, big corporations kind of pushing narrow agendas, and then there's little old Keili, like in a pod in a bank center in Oklahoma City. And she's pushing an agenda in a similar way on the lobbyist front. What's the big difference between the way big companies advocate and lobby and the way you do it?
Well, in terms of how are they different, there's probably not a lot of differences in terms of how we're actually the mechanics of it, in terms of asking for legislation to be introduced and then pushing it along. The mechanics don't really change. Now, what does change is the sort of number of lobbyists, the political muscle, if you will, that a big company might have compared to a credit union. Even though we're a large credit union, we're still not as large as some of the corporations that you may be referencing. And so, so the difference is that I am a one-man shop here at TFCU. I do all of our state and federal lobbying, advocacy, regulatory affairs, political affairs on my own. And so, a big company might have multiple lobbyists and have areas of practice where, you might have somebody on a team that just does regulatory affairs or just does state government affairs. Now, I have done contract lobbying in the past where I was representing multiple corporations and in Oklahoma, and working with large lobbying teams. And so that's often the difference, is really just the size of the team. And then presence in DC. I'm obviously in Oklahoma City. I'm not in DC. I have to travel back and forth.
Yeah.
And so, being in DC has some advantages for sure. I've lived in DC, and being there on the ground creates some real advantages because, you're available to meet with members of Congress or regulators when it's convenient for them, and not just when you can get on an airplane. And so that's, I would say, the other real advantage that a big corporation might have is they probably spread their team out across.
One other thought I had is that it strikes me that there could be a significant free rider problem in this model of what you're doing. If I owned a credit union and I knew that Keili was from TFCU was going to be doing the lobbying work anyways, and that I would benefit from that lobbying work, which we're aligned. We're both in the same business. We both agree that this should happen, that veterans should be entitled to getting commercial loans that don't bump me up against a threshold, a limit of assets that I've got. I would say, why would I pay for my own lobbyist when I know that Keili's out there doing the good work for me, fighting the good fight for me? Does that happen? I mean, are there,
Yes.
I would suspect that not every credit union has an advocacy team. and they're still free riding. They're benefiting from the hard work that you're doing. And if that does happen, it kind of it begs the next question in our business, where I think it'd be interesting to have a VP of governmental affairs. Why would I do that? I'm just a small business, and I could afford a person that, lobbies on behalf of our industry concerns, but I'd be foolish almost to do it, knowing that everybody else in the business would, all of my competitors, friendly though they may be, would also benefit, and I'm covering the cost of the salary. So what do you say to leaders of businesses that are listening who think maybe it'd be a good idea to have a public affairs and advocacy role in their organization, but don't necessarily want to cover that burden all alone?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and it's actually an excellent point. First of all, the premise of the question, it happens in every industry. It happens all of the time.
Sure.
Where a smaller entity in an industry may say, I know that the larger entity is going to cover this issue on our behalf. Now, my response to that is that while that may be the case, I only represent TFCU's interests. And so, what happens in a meeting with a lawmaker when it comes to a policy decision, that conversation between me and that lawmaker is only going to be framed in TFCU's interest. And so, while there may be a lot of alignment between, our credit union and all of the other credit unions in the state, I can't guarantee that will always be the case. Right. And I certainly can't advocate for, it would be completely unethical for me to advocate for another credit union's interests and to represent them in any way. And so, a lot of what I do is education. I'm educating the lawmaker on what a credit union is, how the policy proposal that, of the day, whatever it is we're talking about, whether they've authored it or it's coming up for a vote, how that impacts TFCU. And so I share a lot of what I do is I share a lot of data. I do a lot of talking to lawmakers about, if you pass this bill, then, this is how many people are going to be impacted, or this is how our business is going to be impacted financially, or whatever it may be. And so when I'm advocating for TFCU, if I'm not representing the other, credit unions in Oklahoma, then I can't share their data. I can't share their story.
Right.
I can't talk about how they're serving their members. And so while the outcome may benefit them, to the point you made, it is a disservice to your business to not think about how do you plug in a professional advocate or a lobbyist to really represent you in that meeting, to make sure your business is the one being talked about, your consumer is the one being talked about, and your data is the data being shared. Now, there are lots of great contract lobbyists and trade associations in the state of Oklahoma and across the country that do that kind of work for businesses of all sizes. And so I would encourage anyone who's listening who thinks, I would love to have somebody on my team who can advance, or defend against laws that we need, or regulations that we need to create an, optimized operating environment. I would encourage them to look at what are some other resources they might be able to bring to bear outside of just having somebody internal, like I am internal here at TFCU, but there are lots of people who do this kind of work on contract, and some great lobbyists actually in Oklahoma that do contract work. And then there are also just some really outstanding trade associations that your businesses like yours can become members of and really plug into.
Right. We have NARPM, the National Association of Residential Property Management, that advocates on our behalf. So yeah, I see that for sure in terms of member organizations. I couldn't help but think as you were talking, there's this germane topic of tariffs, and it's very controversial, and I don't need to get into the controversy of it. But I would imagine that steel manufacturers, anybody that's competing, let's talk about, I don't know, milk coming from Canada. I have no clue. But if you're a milk manufacturer in the United States, you would have an advocacy arm that would be saying, yes, President Trump, we really do think this tariff is super important, and saying, rah, 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 the trade imbalance is so significant that we need to put a tariff on Canadian milk. Do you get the sense, because you have a behind the scenes view in a certain sense, that we don't, as lay people, we just do not see the legislative processes closely. We don't see the advocacy processes closely. Do you get the sense that that some of, or that a significant portion of the decisions that we see being made on by legislators, by the president, that we see headlines of, are driven by advocates in a significant way? Or is it oftentimes just the true belief of a policymaker that this should be the way on principle, and it gets pushed without much interference from advocates on either side?
Yes, I think it's both. So I think there are lots of decisions that are made on Capitol Hill and at the state capitals across the country that are, you know, completely based on principle, and delivering often on campaign promises. Elected officials have to run for office, and so they make lots of promises to their constituents, and the good ones uphold those promises, or at least try to.
Sure.
And so there's a lot of principle to the legislative and governance process. However, there are often lots of proposals and initiatives that are being advanced that are coming from folks like me, who are going to Capitol Hill and meeting with members of Congress and saying, have you thought about this? Have you X? If you think about X, it creates a competitive advantage for our industry, whether we're competing globally or competing state to state, wherever it may be. And so there are certainly lots of proposals that are introduced and advanced through the legislative or regulatory process that are driven by people who are subject matter experts. Lobbyists certainly can have sort of a bad reputation, and that, thank you for smoking hasn't helped with that. But great movie.
Terrible movie. Yeah. I advise everybody not to watch it.
Right. But it's there are tons of lobbyists in this country who are lobbying for good and who are working on very purposeful and principled issues, and really trying, to help people, in our case, advance economically, whether that means they need to buy a car or a home or whatever it might be. And so, lawmakers are often not subject matter experts in our field.
Sure.
There are not very many members of Congress who know a whole lot about credit unions or even banking, for that matter. And so, the number of members of Congress who served in or worked in a bank or even were leadership in a bank before they went to Congress are very few.
Yeah.
There are a few, but there are not very many in the entire body. And so
and that would hold true for technology and farming, right, and military and everything else. They have to
any industry.
They're not subject experts in much beyond whatever they did before they were legislating.
That's right. And so as folks, serve on different committees, or they move up maybe in the leadership ranks of their party or their specific chamber, and are in a position to really advance policy, they really rely on folks like me to come in and say, have you considered, maybe introducing a bill that would make the regulatory environment easier for us to operate in? Compliance costs are really high for us. As an industry right now. Have you thought about streamlining, maybe X, piece of legislation to make it easier for us to do business or to lend to a consumer, whatever it may be? And so, the subject matter expertise that lobbyists develop in representing different entities and industries is really important. And certainly, I think there's a bulk of legislation that comes from, in my business, we also have to be very creative. I have to think about, how do I move the needle?
Sure.
It's a competitive, noisy environment. And
Sure.
So if I want to move the needle, how do I maneuver strategically around Washington, D.C. to try to move things forward? That can be tough.
Do you find that the argument that compliance is very expensive falls on deaf ears, or is that something that people are sensitive to? I mean, I could imagine a legislator saying, it's the cost of doing business. You got to stay compliant. And on the other hand, you might say, well, we have to maintain a margin, or our margin is thin. So if you force us to be compliant and it costs us more, we have to pass that on to the consumer. So it's affecting, in our case, 465,000 members, et cetera. Is that, I mean, because in our industry, compliance is a big thing also, not nearly what pharmaceuticals, healthcare, and banking is, but we have to pay all these fees. We have to be members of different realtor boards and our local, real estate commission. They fee us at every angle. And I would think that arguing that those fees are cumbersome and, thinning of our margin would like fall flat, so to speak.
Yeah, so there's really a line, I think, to that argument because, we understand that, our number one responsibility to our members is to be safe and sound. And so, when they put their money here on deposit, they expect that it will stay
Sure.
here and that
Sure.
we will not fail, and that we will, ensure that their money is going to be there for the long term, that it's insured, that it's well invested. And so safety and soundness is our number one job. And that requires some compliance, certainly, with the regulatory, with the regulator, whether you're state or federal. And so it can fall on deaf ears if you get too far over that line,
Sure.
Now the space we try to operate from an advocacy space is where it goes over the line, where it's, there are certainly regulators who have gone way beyond safety and soundness oversight, and are, enforcing penalties on financial institutions, in inappropriate or ways they don't even have statutory authority to do so. And so, that those are often the arguments that we're making, that, there comes a point in time where we are responsible for so much compliance, that it is starting to thin our margins, and we aren't able to return, our money back to our membership base or consumer base, because we're spending so much money on these regulatory schemes that different administrations have put in place. And so we prefer, a lighter regulatory environment because of compliance, but certainly we know that, compliance is also a part of doing business in the financial services space. So you never find us advocating for no,
Sure.
no regulations or
More
no
reasonable.
compliance costs, right? We just want balance.
Right. I want to put you on the hot seat and ask about some very specific property management topics and how you may consider advising those of us in the property management space to counteract some things that I don't agree with. But before I do that, I want to turn to the topic of influence. I mean, advocacy is at its core influence and how you influence people. And so I wanted to know, you've been in public policy advocacy for almost 2 decades, if I'm not wrong. And I wanted to pull out from you some of the biggest lessons that you've learned about influence, wielding it, channeling it, and making it work for you.
Well, that's a great question. I actually recently had an opportunity to hear a longtime colleague speak to a group of young professionals, and she was asked a similar question, and she gave what I thought was a really great but incredibly simple answer, but I think it is the right answer. And that is that influence, when it comes down to it, is really about having common sense and a little bit of kind of street smart, if you will. And so when I'm talking to a lawmaker, it's really important that I understand who they are, what makes them tick, what were their campaign promises, how did they get elected, how long have they served in whatever role they might be in, and what are they trying to do, what's on their personal agenda. And if I can understand that, what makes that person tick, and I can connect to it, then that is often kind of the secret sauce to influence. Now, I also need to know my stuff. I need to show up to the meeting and understand what it is that I'm advocating for and why and how to explain it in a way that connects to that lawmaker. And so, it's sort of being on both sides of that coin. You've got to really understand who that lawmaker is. And so, as you can imagine, I spend a lot of time building relationships and thinking about relationships and following what, lawmakers are saying and what they're writing about, what they're, what op-ed they placed in the newspaper, what they're posting on social media. But I also spend a lot of face time with them and listen to the things that they talk about. Do they talk about, their kids? Are they interested in economic development or whatever it may be, so that when I show up in that room and I want to influence that lawmaker, I can connect the issue of the day to whatever it is that makes them tick. And so, and that, you're right. I've worked in this business for just over 20 years, which is sort of remarkable to me that I've been in this business that long. But I have found that is the most meaningful way to advance public policy, because at the end of the day, elected officials are people, right? They ran for office because they believed in a better state, if you will, for our country, for the state of Oklahoma, the state of Texas. And so if I can connect those dots for them, I can often move the needle. Now, sometimes that takes a really long time, but yeah, that's a big part of influence.
Before the hot seat that I'm going to put you on, which is going to be very tough, by the way. I want to make that clear.
I can't wait.
I want to ask one more question. Do you have any secrets to transitioning a conversation from the niceties, the pleasantries with a representative that you're dealing with? How are the kids? How are your, I don't know, campaign promises going? Whatever you'd say, like on a very superficial level, to like, let's get down. We're going to transition to getting down to business, and I'm going to tell you about TFCU and what I need from you, what I need you to know about this legislation. Do you have any quick switches?
Yeah. So first of all, I'll tell you that I often will tell the lawmaker before I come to their office what I'm going to be there to talk about. Because in my business, being honest is really critical. It is incredibly important to be trustworthy, and to even if the conversation is going to be a tough one, to be really honest and open and upfront about what you're there to talk about, because your word is everything in the lobbying business, right? And I'm sure that's the case for many industries, but once you've lied to a lawmaker or represented a position differently than the business who hired you wanted you to, then it's hard to recover from that. And so I will often let the lawmaker know in advance. So before I schedule the meeting, I'll say, I'd like to come visit with you about, the Credit Card Competition Act, which is something that all financial institutions are opposed to. All financial institutions are opposed to that specific proposal. And so, so that they know coming, when I sit down, I'm going to say hello. I'm going to talk to them about, their son who, plays football for the local high school. But then I'm going to reach a point in the conversation where I'm going to say, listen, I know you're the author of the Credit Card Competition Act, and that's a bill we oppose. So let me tell you why. And that's where, to the point I made in the last question, where I've got to know my stuff. I've got to be able to walk the lawmaker through why, my institution is opposed to a specific piece of legislation, and be really ready to present that position and why it's bad for business for us. And I've also got to be ready for tough questions. So you got to have a thick skin in this business.
I imagine. Especially if they authored the bill.
Yeah. It's never fun to tell a bill author that you don't like their bill, but it's always the right thing to do. It is always the right thing to do.
That's tough conversation. Okay. Now the hot seat.
I'm ready.
Property management, very specific to property managers. We're kind of stuck in this weird spot where we are often considered realtors or agents, brokers, whatever the nomenclature is for a specific state. And yet we don't do much, if any, of the traditional work of a real estate agent. So we have to know property management. We need to know leases and landlord-tenant act, landlord-tenant law, but we're not doing traditional sale documents. We're not doing disclosures and a bunch of other stuff. Yet we're treated like we do. We've got to follow all of the regulatory frameworks, all the continuing education specific to real estate agents. And we have to be, of course, real estate agents, which comes with significant fees and a bunch of other stuff that if you're a real estate agent and you sell a $100,000 house, you may make $30,000 and you may take some portion of that. Your broker's going to take some portion of that, but that $20,000 that's left in your pocket covers the fees 20 times over that you have to pay. We're not in that position. We don't make that, yet we are all bound by the same legislation and the same laws. It's complex. There are obligations that don't make any sense to us, and they're sometimes designed for like larger institutions and not, small businesses like us. What's the right angle to push to advocate for ensuring that there are professional standards associated with property management, but that they're not the same ones that are imposed upon real estate agents or realtors, if you're a member of the National Association of Realtors, that just right sizing the legislation so that you're not encumbered by all of the stuff that you have to do when you are doing transactions and handling assets, hundreds of thousands of dollars of somebody's primary residence or millions of dollars of somebody's primary residence.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would advise that the very first thing that it's incumbent upon property managers to do is to go build relationships with lawmakers and tell the very story that you just told. I thought what you just said was very compelling, and so getting into a lawmaker's office and saying, this is a little bit about our business model, and here's why it's different than a realtor's. And this is how, either the laws that you're advancing or the regulations that are being proposed by, state agencies or whoever it may be are creating a really cumbersome operating environment for you. Would you be willing to work with us on making some changes to kind of right size the law so that we are, not subject to statutory or regulatory environment that doesn't make sense for us. And so, that's a lot of what I do for a credit union is talk about, how is a credit union different than a bank, and how does right size or one size fits all approach not always work for financial institutions, and how can we right size some of those regulations? And so I would encourage you to do the same. The most important thing that you can do as an industry, that you, Mac, could do is look up who represents you in the Oklahoma State Legislature, and look that person up online. Their contact information should be readily available to you as a constituent, and reach out to them and say, hey, I'm a property manager. I'm based in Tulsa. I have some concerns about the statutory environment that we work under. Could we grab a cup of coffee? I'd like to tell you a little bit about my business. I'd like to tell you a little bit about why we're different than realtors, and see if you might have some ideas for how we could advance legislation that might change that. And and don't just show up once in a meeting with that lawmaker, but continuously, and really educate the folks that represent you to on what is optimal for your business. And my guess is that over time, you'll build some real champions in the legislature that say, you know what, I've got a group of property managers that I represent, and they're having a hard time with the legal environment that we've created for them, or the compliance environment. And so I'm going to propose some changes to the law, and that can really make a difference. I would also encourage you to talk about that publicly. Public opinion, especially in the environment we're in now, where government's becoming incredibly complex and very difficult to navigate, and really takes a lot of subject matter expertise. Public opinion is still one of the things that will cut through that noise and really sway a lawmaker or group of lawmakers' opinion on a piece of legislation. And so, telling that story to the lawmaker and building that relationship is really important, but also sharing it publicly so that people understand the differences in your business model versus others is really important. And there are lots of ways you can do that.
Would you?
This podcast is one of them, probably.
Yeah, for sure. Would you encourage me to form a little coalition of other property managers to enlisting their support and doing the same?
Yeah, absolutely. I think anytime that you can, there's definitely power in numbers. And so anytime that you can say, this is important to my business, but it's also important to these 30 other businesses in the Tulsa market.
Yeah.
And so, we're not just standing alone here, but this is it's either a threat or a growing problem for an entire industry. Then, that speaks certainly a lot louder. And if that coalition can come together and, come up with an agenda of policy ideas that you'd like to advance or defeat, and then also, each of those folks in that coalition can build a relationship with their lawmakers and influence public opinion with their constituents and the public. I think that there's a lot of power in doing that, and it's how you get things advanced at the state capitol. So absolutely.
I'm going to do it. It's going to be a long uphill battle, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to get my friend Tracy Strike from Renter's Place. I'm going to call him right after this, and I'm going to put together the first 2 members of our coalition. Keili McEwen serves as the Vice President of Governmental Affairs at Tinker Federal Credit Union, TFCU. It's Oklahoma's largest credit union. And in this role, she leads all state and federal advocacy, legislative strategy, and political engagement on behalf of the $6 billion financial institution. With more than 2 decades of experience in public policy, political strategy, and coalition building, Keili brings a forward-thinking approach to influence rooted in principle and purpose. And we talked about some of that influence here on the pod. Keili is a trailblazer in credit union advocacy. She was the first in-house lobbyist for a nonprofit financial institution in Oklahoma, and her leadership has helped shape the future of credit union policy while ensuring the voices of members and mission-driven institutions are effectively represented in government. Keili, we so appreciate you being on the show, educating us, as I said, for the first time on advocacy and creating or shaping public policy.
Matt, glad to do it. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a guest. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate your time today.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Same Day Podcast. Tune in to a new show each week and be sure to subscribe to get future episodes.